Welcome to the Theology Pugcast. We're really glad that you've tuned in. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest, right outside Portland, Oregon. I've written a lot of stuff, and I'm a senior editor for Touchstone Magazine. Okay, Glenn.
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I am a professor emeritus of history at Central Connecticut State University, senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I've got my own 501c3, Every Square Inch Ministries at esquareinch.org, and I'm a Substack writer.
Okay, Tom, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and let us know what we're talking about today, and take us take it off. Go ahead and get us going.
Get us going. Okay, I'm Tom Price. Teach Christian theology, Christian ethics at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and I serve a church here in Connecticut. Well, here for me in Connecticut. Topic today is kind of a bit of a broad topic, but I really want to jump back into some themes related to the way in which, for example, culture forms us. It forms our dispositions, the way we think about things, what options are there for us to think about things, what limits culture sort of supplies, and then ways in which we're formed in a larger culture also by differing cultures, like maybe our moral Christian traditions or our spiritual traditions and things like this, and how sometimes these things can walk along hand in hand and not cause fundamental conflict, but at other times they can be very conflictual because they don't share the same worlds of meaning and they don't share the same goals of perception of reality. So I want to jump into that, the significance of the way we're formed culturally, but also look at the way, what does it mean for a Christian to think about how we, educate our first steps into reality, maybe to the young, but also for people that are growing and learning and ever learning, to be discipled into perceiving things that are true, but aren't necessarily on the surface for things because we have been formed by culture in particular ways and we don't have an antenna for them. So that's kind of anything within that range is fair go today.
All right. Well, sounds great. Reminds me of something I just read in First Things. Michael Hamby reviewed Paul Kingsnorth's book, Against the Machine. I'll pull that quote in later when it seems appropriate, but it's right in line with what you're talking about.
Yeah, and the neat thing about Hanby, we've talked about a lot on this show. I think one of the things that makes this show fascinating, our podcast, if I'm allowed to say that, is that even though we work within, of course, what you would say along with our tradition, our Reformed heritage, we also work across traditions. In a certain way, not across to every tradition, but those that share, I think there's a lot of shared theological roots and commitments to reality. And Hanby, I think, would be one of those. He's been on our show before, and I think especially where we understand the significance of the theology of creation and the significance of the incarnation for seeing reality and being able to get a hold of things that are there. So some of those figures, like Hanby, have a lot to say, I think, in line with what I'm talking about. And we've had a lot of different people on those themes as well. But I think a first step in is one thing I have noticed, and I've seen you even post some things about it, and we've been talking about it a long time. But one of the things that you see is you start to see how intense technology and science, for example, has formed us and our culture and the options that are there. One of the things you do see for a long period of time has been a move away from certain kinds of things that, say, Christians of the West took for granted in terms of reality at different times. And one of these, of course, would be that we have a created world given to us, often by the perception of Christianity and the different cultures that had engaged and forged its theology in relation to, that things have essences, that things have purposes, that there should be a stance and a relationship to these things that isn't just one of seeing how they work on a material level and then what we can do with them for a certain kind of set of desires that may or may not be good. And that's one set of concerns. Another is that the more this kind of formation takes place, the more detached our relationship comes to certain things that we used to be able to take for granted, like a household, like a family, like family and children. And these used to be our immersion, our first steps into reality, because reality is structured that way. But because there's been, through these avenues of technology and certain conceptions, formations of what it means to be a human and what is good for it, supposedly, it's wreaked havoc on that taken for granted world and the way it should work. And so education into reality isn't what it used to be.
Right. Well, let me go ahead and read this quotation. This is Hanby in his review. Um, it's in First Things. So, the reason I bring it up right now is it's right on board with what you're talking about. The rediscovery of older ways of seeing also surely entails the rediscovery and renewal of older ways of thinking, and indeed of an older conception of intelligence that have become largely unintelligible to us. The name intellect, Aquinas said, arises from the intellect's ability to know the most profound elements of a thing. For to understand intelligence means to read what is inside a thing. Sense and imagination know only external accidents, but the intellect alone penetrates to the interior, to the essence of a thing. Now, I posted this online, and some wag made a comment that basically wrote it all off as if he's the intellectual equal of Hanby and Aquinas.
They're always out there, and they're usually online.
Right, and it basically it was basically, that's just your opinion, man.
But this is kind of what I mean. This is one of the things that I think is a concern, is that I think in cultures in which a host of different types of impulses and forces have formed us certain ways, and certain breakdowns have happened to make our relationship to older natural givens more mediated through what I would say is artificial structures, those that can't really hold but do hold as long as our technology and our for example, our the way our society is governed holds. But they're fragile, and they're fragile because they aren't connected to reality in a strong sense. They are in some sense constructed, just and then in another sense that they wouldn't really hold if too much pressure sat on top of a society that the technology and the structures of society couldn't hold. And that can break. We take it for granted right now because it has held, quite strong for a long time. But I think we're starting to see, as we eat at reality more and more, what the outcomes, the deadly outcomes for human living and flourishing, much less normal relationships. It's heavy, but I think one of the things you see that is difficult is we've been so shaped early on to be pluralistic about our way of understanding reality, to take every side. We jump in from a position of all truth basically is relative, and that you can take up any angle and see something valid. So therefore, there is no valid way in. No tradition better than any other. And so for you to say the intellect will get you there is just for you to kind of, push your meta narrative.
It's just your opinion, man.
Yeah, it's your opinion, your meta narrative.
Well, I want to go to somebody who had a few things to say about education, a guy by the name of C.S. Lewis. Lewis, not speaking in the context of education, but more in the context of our way of envisioning the world, which is fundamentally what we're talking about here. Yeah. At the end of the discarded image, in the epilogue, one of the things that he says is that the reason why the medieval model, as he called it, was discarded, he said it was discarded, not disproven. And he says the reason why it was discarded is that we started asking different questions. And when you ask different questions, I forgot exactly how he put it, but basically the universe gives you different answers depending on the questions you are asking.
Yeah.
And the point was that we started asking questions like, how does this work? More than what does this mean? Or better, more than what does it mean to be human?
Yeah.
And as a result, we end up with this, mechanistic vision of the universe and the world and everything else, completely devoid of any meaning or of any purpose for humanity. And it seems to me that the crisis of education that you're talking about starts at that point. It starts with the fundamental questions we've been asking of the universe and the answers that we have assumed as a result.
Yeah.
Yep.
This brings up something, Glenn, that's really fun to think a little bit about, and that is kind of the nature of questioning, and the fact that every question is a sort of begging the question kind of thing, in the sense that it has a number of assumptions that have already informed the question. That sometimes the question itself is assuming a certain answer. That, okay, the reason why we ask these questions is we already have proven that the world is just material, matter in motion. That's actually, something that we shouldn't take for granted. That's something that, if you take that for granted, you don't. It gets back to your point earlier. It's not as though the older way of thinking was disproven. It's just that we don't want to ask that question anymore.
Yeah.
Right. And it's worth noting that the people who started asking the question, how does this work, were people who were asking it really from a Christian framework.
Yeah.
But the kinds of answers that began emerging, I think, allowed people who wanted to give up Christianity, generally for non-intellectual reasons, it allowed them to push into deism, and then deism breaks down to materialism actually pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what you have going on oftentimes is, people who think about this, especially pedagogy and things like that, they'll often talk about what is happening on that level is you already have cultural shifts with, in theological, for example, let's say the field of theology. You have new theological cultures developing that make those questions seem the kind of things to be asking, and then they sort of take off and take shape from there. I mean, for example, a lot of what we would consider in the field of theology as the kind of what we would call the modern culture of theology that really shapes how we do theological work and relate to the Bible. Some of it got kickstarted with the kinds of different questions, say Philip Melanchthon was asking to a text and loco communes and these types of things that are very different than the, is it kind of questions and the reality questions you get at the beginning of certain scholastic manuals, which they thought didn't need to really be asked. It could lead to speculation because you already had a shifting of culture and expectation happening. And this is kind of that's just kind of what I'm after, is the way these questions already almost become manifestations of shifts on a certain kind of cultural formation level that makes them interesting and makes them the focus.
Yeah. If you once you bring up Melanchthon, and you're in my period. Okay?
I knew I was going to get that.
Yeah. What happens all the way back with Petrarch in the 14th century? What happens is that Petrarch argues fundamentally that dialectic, logic, loosely, the dialectic shouldn't really be the high point of education, which it really is in scholasticism. Because what you're trying to do is incorporate as much material as possible logically into your system. So that's really the goal of the scholastics. And as a result, scholastics, you would never read a text by itself. You always read the text with the glosses, with the commentaries, and so on, because the object is to integrate all this stuff together.
And you have a different notion of authority happening there, because authority is what they're all sharing in order to have that communal interpretation of that gloss.
Right.
In other words, you're not questioning the authority of that text. You're all agreeing to it, and it creates a different culture.
Right.
Yeah, I'd like to.
Going to reject that, and that's and Petrarch then leads the way into what you're seeing with Melanchthon and Calvin, a lot of these guys. So we
I'd
can
like
get into
to
that more later.
just
But
just quickly before we move on, talk a little bit about this shift that Lewis was addressing that Glenn brought up. So I just finished reading a piece by Peter Thiel in the latest First Things. I don't know if you guys saw that, Voyages to the End of the World, and it's fascinating. It's fascinating because this may be the only tech bro that actually is conversant with the Western tradition in the depth that you would hope somebody would be.
Yeah.
And his treatment of the New Atlantis, Bacon's voyage story, is really fascinating because he has a Straussian reading of it. He says this guy is thoroughly materialistic and he's pretending to be a Christian.
Yeah.
And I've wondered about that.
Yeah.
And he brings up his connection to Hobbes and just all these kinds of things. And but it gets to this point now with regard to Thiel. I think he's on the same page with Bacon. I think that he's kind of a he's I think Thiel is torn. I'm going to be with him in a couple of weeks, and I'm going to ask him about that piece. But I think he's trying to figure out just whether or not the kind of the Baconian project is our salvation or our damnation. And here's a guy that's right in the middle of it.
Well, right there is what I'm kind of interested in. What is allowing him to see that when so many people, even within our own formation traditions, don't see it? And this is one of the, he that's got, they got eyes to see. But right here you have, because we've said it, I've been beating that drum for a long time that Bacon is not our best friend. I know that he comes in a cultural, context.
Well, he's quoting scripture all over the place, and a lot of Reformed ghetto people just love that. But it takes Thiel to say he's completely blowing it. He's like blowing smoke at you guys.
The metaphysical substructure under the Christian lingo has changed when you have Bacon in place. So no matter how much on this is what I mean. Bacon's working in a culture that was using the language of a lot of the outflow of Protestant Christianity and Puritan, this language of dominion, of restoring Eden. Now that that the gospel has come, and this the new Adam and going back, and so now we have this ability. And notice the thing that it's taken for granted with Bacon: the ability to perceive in such a way that we can renew and restore. So you have a perception language going on. And they are right. He is correct enough to know that what they were getting a hold of was going to have a huge impact in the material world and impact all of our lives. I mean, that's what they did see. But they were the first ones to redefine dominion almost back, that set it up to be able to be used as libido dominandi again, the old return of a distorted use of dominion. And then the other thing is the way it can bracket out eventually formal and final causes. That is the aspect that things have real essences and natures that are the sign God has given them for the meaning they have in the world. And it isn't something arbitrary or even individual. And so there is a purpose to these things that allows different things to flourish when they're understood the right way and cultivated the right way, and they can do hellish damage. When
the thing about Thiel is he's sophisticated enough to know that there's an esoteric way to read text, particularly if you find yourself in a political environment where saying what you really think could get you in a lot of trouble.
Yeah,
and that's the Straussian approach.
Yeah,
I think that most of our Reformed ghetto friends, and I use that term fully implying that they need to open the windows and open the doors and let some air in every once in a while, is that they don't have an ability to do that. What Thiel has done, reading Bacon.
Yeah, and this is, I think, one of the questions, and this is not. I mean, I say this because this is a question Christians have asked from the get-go. And I use theology and its methodology, or reading scripture and its methodology, as kind of an analogy that applies to the rest. Is what allowed the church to be able, when it engaged Hellenic culture, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater and not just have, for example, an approach to nature and the created world that just spoke in terms of kind of divine command theory without there being a real created order out there that has real essences and purposes built in to which those commands fit when they are enacted the right way. What allowed the church to see and distinguish these kinds of things at certain given points? But it really comes down to, can we, or how can we, or what is the best way to be educating our people, whether it's in our churches or if we're teaching in schools or homes, however, to be able to see these things, have perception, and not just follow the formation that culture and technology and scientism and everything around us has flooded us with, so that we bring that formation into our reading of the Bible and church practice and everything else. And the significance of what we have to say theologically is not actually helping us see better and discern these things that are there, contribute to discerning the dangerous territory we're in when it comes to technology, especially, but not only, by our inability to see that there are purposes here that are being exploited and being played with, and that are being, and we are part of that project. We human beings are part of what's being tinkered with, because they don't see, those doing the tinkering, that the kind of natures we have are meant to be paused before, are meant to be reflected upon soberly before enacting anything that would violate that which is proper to being, the kind of signs we are as image bearers of God, for example. And so I think that it's not as easy as just giving information, just a lot of, for example, just retrieving theology, right? That's a good step. That's not the only step.
Right.
Let me go back to the Renaissance for a moment, because I think that there's something here that just occurred to me that I think it might be interesting to explore a bit. Okay, so you have the scholastics who are working with these logical systems and developing their way of study just on the basis of integrating all of these ideas. Petrarch comes along and he says, yeah, when Aristotle wrote, or whoever wrote, they intended people to be able to understand them without all these glosses and commentaries that hadn't been written yet. So how about we get rid of all of those and just go back and read the text for itself? Good move. We do a lot of that too, although not entirely. But then he went on from there to say that dialectic is not really the crowning point of education. That's really rhetoric. And so rhetoric then becomes the centerpiece of education. By the time you get to the 16th century, there's a debate, which I think is more of a sort of an academic, I'm not sure how serious it is, let's put it that way, on whether logic or dialectic or clarity is the criterion for truth. In other words, is truth found in what is logically cogent, or is truth found in what is clear?
Mm-hmm.
And you get a debate going on around that. The people advocating for clarity are, ironically enough, the humanists, many of whose writing is so florid as to be nearly opaque. But what's the point of rhetoric? The point of rhetoric is to present your case and all of that in a way that's convincing. But ultimately, what rhetoric is for is utilitarian. It is ultimately for getting the result you want. Many Renaissance humanists got jobs with corporations acting as salesmen because they could be so convincing and could suck up to people so well. Things like that. So there's a utilitarian aspect for it. So what you're doing is you're using language to achieve what it is that you want to achieve. How is that different from what Bacon's doing? Bacon is saying we should learn about the material world by empirical observation so that we can use it to do what we want it to do. We can manipulate it to produce the results we want. exactly the same thing that is happening with language with this new emphasis on rhetoric. I don't know, this idea that...
No, but I think this is interesting because you're dealing with here, if I take your word for it, it's the case that what you have though, and I think even Augustine caught on to this, is why he left being part of the chair of, he left being a teacher of rhetoric because he saw where it goes if he actually thought it was manipulating students into going into a career of deception, because of the way in which rhetoric was basically became a tool of manipulation for lawyers and things like that. And he didn't want to be part of making careers of that. But I think one of the things he and other theologians would have been worked hard to do is show that language isn't that loose to reality. Yes, there are ways of detaching it. This is what we're dealing with kind of social constructivism. But language is really our first step into reality, isn't it? It's a logos centered. It is an interpretive for human beings. It's an interpretive and a participatory way of entering into the meaning of things. And so language isn't strictly to be the kind of thing that you can detach from reality and strictly manipulate with. This is why Scripture, of course, condemns that sort of thing as lying on one level, and this is why you don't use language inappropriately in referencing things. Why? Because reality and language, naming, is so fundamental, and this is one of the problems. What's his name? Robert Spaeman. We all know his stuff, but one of the things he talks about is the way in which language is this first step into our education period. And education is really not towards some end so much as an immersion in language and how we interact with things. But he was taking for granted when he wrote this in 85 that some of the things that we use language for are just not controversial. He was talking back then about, how we distinguish, for example, the difference between one animal and another. And I said, if he only was writing now, he'd be realizing that too was taken for granted. But he did already start to note the way in which he's talked about scientific civilization and technological specialization, and the way in which they are causing something similar to happen, the way they're causing language and our references and our immersion in reality to be a step out of it rather than into it, and allows for that kind of manipulation and everything else. And he has a lot more to say there. But I think something interesting here, one of the things that people that were concerned about this, I know back in my educational formation, was a figure like, say, Alistair McIntyre, and he, in particular, he started out, as you both know, a Marxist, right? I mean, he was somebody writing on practice and ethics and praxis. But one of the things he came to see as he studied moral formation in history was the way in which the whole encyclopedic project of modernity that owed itself a lot to these changes, but then the whole Nietzschean genealogical stuff, they both had something about them that was correct, but something immensely wrong about them. And he thinks that the one thing that does come out of that say Thomas or Augustine or those traditions didn't have an antenna for it, was just how significant culture forms us. This is something that will come later. And the way in which you cannot, reason is not something, as they're arguing about dialectic in the scholastic period. Reason is not something that does not come immersed and embodied. It's in our activities and our practices. And so in everything we do is the embodiment of some understanding of reality and interpretation of it. This is where he kind of takes it, right? Yeah. And you can't escape. But what is key there, and this is, I think, what Hanby's onto, this is what I think even presuppositionalists are onto, why there can be crossovers, is that they know that these things aren't value neutral and are not something that is just mere play to manipulate. So what you have to do is start to begin, what types of traditions of knowing and learning are the kind that help you see that reality better and more open to it, versus those kinds that shut the door to it and allow you to manipulate it.
Can I give you a weird example of this?
Yeah.
The encyclopedia produced during the Enlightenment was organized alphabetically. And we think that that's the natural way of doing it. But this was actually an epistemological statement.
Yeah.
Up to this point, any kind of attempt at an encyclopedia was arranged thematically according to the logical connections between fields.
Yeah.
So they were not alphabetical. You would look at how all these different things connect. Well, Locke comes along and says that there are no innate structures in the human mind, and as a result, all of these things are arbitrary. They're things that we develop ourselves.
Right.
The encyclopedists come along and say, we shouldn't cook the books here. We shouldn't present it in any form of logical structure because those are more or less arbitrary anyway. We should give people the articles and let them form their own way of associating things. With the net result that knowledge becomes atomized, and you no longer see coherent pictures of how all these various things interact with each other, except you construct it yourself.
But doesn't that also sort of, again, beg the question? And that is that there is no structure. That
right. They're assuming it on the basis of Lockean psychology.
Yeah, and Locke ends up being much more of a materialist in the end. In philosophy, we say he produces sort of what you call the property dualist model of the human being, where your mind is basically a property of your body. It's a reaction to it. So it isn't something that has connected to agency or anything else. It is a lessening of what we classically as Christians understood the human to be.
So the vexing character of all this, if we just go back to Genesis, is we have God speaking in chapters 1 and 2. We have an allusion to man speaking, but we don't actually hear him so much, except when he names his wife. But then, in chapter 3, we have the lies. We have the beginning. So right at the start, we have lying.
Yeah,
which is saying things that are just not the case.
Yeah.
And with the intent of steering people, the very fierce human beings, away from the truth. And so this is kind of what we're all stuck with. So even when we are interacting with, say, this, the constructivists, the people that say it's just that way all the way down, we have to at least concede that we do live in a world filled with illusions and filled with programs that are intended to deceive us and get us to go along with things that aren't in our best interest. So we can't just say that's not the case.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. The constructivists are onto that aspect that there is a human contribution to knowing, and that contribution can either be something that opens it to reality or something that distorts or closes it. Right. That is, I think, why it's so fundamental. The kind of, to use McIntyre's term, the kind of narrative that you're formed by, the kind of language that is predominantly shaping your knowing, the kind of language that immerses you in the reality. Because the more it allows you to be open to reality, this is what he would say. This is why he is not a relativist. He's not someone who thinks all traditions are of the same. He just wants to say basically that all ideas come to us in our way of having to interact meaningful with the world, and it is interpreted. And so that means that how we interpret it assumes something about its reality, about God. You can't escape it. This is where I think we share a lot with someone like Hanby and others, because we're all kind of Augustinian in that dimension, that there is a way in which there is no neutral things that we bring the meaning to. This is where the constructivists are wrong. There are real things, and they're real signs, and they point in real directions. And what happens is, based on our relationship to them, and one of the key relationships is the formation that we have entered into. And if that is a formation that is constantly having us cut off from that reality, I think technology and the way it serves modern purposes is increasingly doing that, or it only opens us up to certain aspects about it so that we can manipulate it to do certain things that the modern world said are worth worth pursuing, like our own gratification, our own, total power. These are different ways of forming and shaping people's relationship than, say, those that see everything as bound fundamentally as gift, and that we should pause before interacting. And the way we interacting should take the gift yet broken character of things seriously. And now this is not something easy, and it may not be something many people will go along with. But on the other hand, I think we as Christians who are meant to see and see from the rich vision we've been given, we have to start doing it. And if we don't, people like, Teal will begin doing it, but which direction will it go, And so we do have a stake in this.
Yeah. So getting to this matter of kind of getting to the truth of things, which is what that quotation from Hamby was all about. We do possess the equipment to perceive. It's the intellect that he's referring to. So your point about how we're formed, I don't think he's denying that. Yeah. But even when we're formed, there is some hope that we can get kind of past. Say maybe the sort of the cultural constraints or sort of the limitations of how we see things.
And to even say McIntyre's point, he would say exactly, because some kinds of formation, which we would say as Christians, kind of the right kind of theological and metaphysical formation, for example, not only that, the right kind of practices of relating to things too, those do open you to reality in better ways for your intellect to push through the distorting aspects of bad formation and begin to see. Now, you're not going to see it all at once. And I think this is bringing us back closer, Glenn, this is interesting, to patristic ways of seeing things and the way in which spiritual, intellectual, and then, of course, embodied types of cultivation all go hand in hand. And this is I think it's a much richer way of looking at things, a much more deeply Christian one, I think. But I think we're taking baby steps at learning how to do it when it should have been something we should be familiar with.
Right. Yeah, if we weren't surrounded by great works from the past, we'd be in an even worse shape than we are, because those works have a way of scolding us.
Yes.
So like when you walk into something like a great European cathedral and you realize a bunch of uneducated peasants created this magnificent thing. Yeah. What does that say about us and the crudities that we celebrate now that just appeal to fallen desires, just the passions that are unredeemed, what Paul was getting at when he was talking about the flesh.
Yeah.
Right.
And that, that raises, we ask this question a lot in the church context. It raises why our antenna is often met at just reduplicating what the crass or, kind of context, social and cultural context we're in, and making that kind of the high point of what we have to offer as Christians, that look, we can jump up and down and do this or that too, or we can have, a therapeutic key to fixing our
right.
this worldly desires and happiness with a Christian gloss on it. And I say that, I understand there's more to it than that, but what I'm saying is that we don't penetrate these levels of significance, and we don't see well. And this gets into a host of things. One area we could spend a lot of time, and I don't want to go there, but our inability to, I think, pay attention. The more we're distracted, I get sometimes embarrassed when I get that little thing on my phone that says, "You've spent this amount of time on the phone." I have to, that's why you don't see me on social media for about a month. It's kind of like I need to purge out here. But it's, but more than that, it's this, the way you need to attend to something, to carefully know and relate to it, is something I think we ignore. I remember there was a book that I read in seminary. It was something I think it was was a variation on Mortimer Adler's book, How to Read a Book. And in this book, they were training us how to read a biblical text before doing a sermon. And they were quoting, I don't know if it was one of the significant scientists of all things, who would train his students to observe. And he would go, okay, go spend like 7 hours and write out everything you observe. And then he would see them after the 7 hours walking down the street. He basically said, no, go back now another 2 hours, write out. And he would keep doing this, but basically teaching their focus and attention to detail.
Right.
And I think even with, all the distractions and all the shortcuts to sermon prep and all this, which, gives us more time to do other things or other. But I do think we're missing layers of that depth and layers of our formation to attune to that depth. And I don't always know the best practices of getting a hold of these things again. I understand kind of resistance tactics and ascetic practices, but how to educate to making that important again.
Yeah. And there are always going to be some people who are better at it than other people. And I think maybe that's why some people just throw in the towel, but you don't know what your proclivities are, what your gifts are until you dive into some things, and actually do stuff. And we just find ourselves being challenged less and less to do any of that. Yeah. Particularly with AI, which is now a huge bane on kind of the process of learning, because everybody is like letting it basically do their work for them. All the hard work that is required, and it's all justified in the interests of efficiency and time management and stuff.
Well, here's the thing. There, already, just as a limited human being, I remember my professor of church history, David Puckett in seminary. I remember him. I was talking about Jonathan Edwards, of all things, who pretty much was up to date on all the latest philosophy as well as the history of the church. And he looked at me. He said, "But he could do it back then." And I did. I was kind of went and I was thinking about that a while. But really, there were only X amount of works.
Yeah, it was limited
amount of documents, but in accessibility. But you did not have this flood of 6,000 books published now on this topic and this topic and this topic. Glenn,
he also had servants.
Yeah, well, yeah. That helps, and especially if they're reading the works for him.
Well, I think he was doing everything. They were doing everything else for him.
Yeah.
Cutting his wood, all that kind of stuff.
But even if you had servants today, I don't think that, even if you could, I don't think you could get everything down on every topic, because there's just so much of a flood. I can't. I have to be very selective on the kinds of things I attend to. There are a lot of things I want to read related to something, but you look right now on the flood. There's so much stuff on technology right now, and a lot of things need to be said. But look at the flood of stuff. I get now in my box stuff on ethics of AI that just 6 months ago wasn't there, and now it's just stacked.
Yeah.
And then with AI writing stuff.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, so for, obviously that's something I've been doing a lot of work with and thinking about, and the ability to digest and to provide something to other people that pulls things together and provides some ways to understand takes a lot of work.
It does.
So for the longest time, I was trying to, and we've mentioned it on the show before, I think, trying to find the right metaphor to understand what AI is and what it does for us. Because most of the things that we've been told that we should be afraid of have to do with consciousness, that this thing is going to become conscious and that we're going to lose control.
Yeah.
And it's just, that's kind of the last thing we should be worrying about.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't mean we shouldn't worry about losing control, but there's something very different. So for the longest time, I was like, what is it that I can use to help people get this? Because every time I would try to to address the dangers, everybody said, well, if it's not conscious, we've got nothing to worry about. I was like, no, you don't get it.
Yeah. You
And
actually have more to worry about.
yeah,
because
but then eventually I stumbled on the golem.
Yeah.
That is the perfect, in my mind, kind of thing to compare it to. And golems are pretty scary when you understand the legends and how they, what they were.
Yeah. And those things, that is the it's, for me, similarly, it's the intellectual academic kind of abstract thinking. That's its own vehicle. I mean, that takes a lot to work through when you're working through these issues and taking a stand in relationship to them, because you have to show why you're taking them and why the others aren't. And that takes a lot of time with longer work. But then trying to communicate that somebody who is not just a specialist, that's its own brand of rigorous. And so, I mean, I think AI becomes a shortcut for people, put together a metaphor for me that ties all this together. And then not only have we shortened the process of the person producing it and their cultivation of being able to work through the hard work of providing that, but then you've also cheapened the what you've given to someone else. And, it's this kind of maybe a good kind of last thread to go on is we have lost almost the significance of getting wisdom from elders. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that, I'll give you an example. I see it, it's a grace to see a lot of the stuff that, we hoped would be out for exactly in the Christian world to be out there. I mean, now we have, conferences on the beatific vision and on the, and this is all exciting. But then you start to see a kind of veneer there, and then a realization that a lot of it isn't really going in the direction that requires wisdom to direct it. It's almost put itself in, this is fashionable, this is marketable. Yes, the trade-off is that we're going to get a lot of people talking about it and it will do its thing. But no, not necessarily. And so we've used the kind of the forms and fashions of mechanistic culture, consumerist, popularist culture, and technology without knowing what vehicle we're putting this in unreflectively. Right. And so what you don't have is the people that have been working through this stuff long enough to listen to and say, wait a minute, that's not the direction this should be going.
And then we just have one fad following another, and an amnesia that, the thing that we're kind of excited about 50 years ago, people were excited about it then, but we think that we're brand new and we've just discovered it.
One of the highlights of my time as a student of Oxford is I got to sit in his last years. He came and did a modern doctrine seminar, the great historian of church history, Henry Chadwick. And he was in his 90s. He was still studying in the German theological dictionaries. But one of the things I remember is all the trendsetters, the John Milbank, all these ones who were fashionable in that time, they were in that room drooling over everything that man said. And the reason was they too knew that they at that time were frauds. And they were sitting in front of a genuine article. And that what he said was really going to take their work in directions they weren't able to muster up. And I think there is something that we need to think about in these kind of sages. Whether you agree with Chadwick on everything or not wasn't the point. This guy had a length of wisdom and knowledge and how to interact with it, that the fashion that takes over and, like you said, becomes a quick trend and dies out, it doesn't have the same impact. And people know it when we're starting to realize the limit of their own, their own productivity, and when they could really gain something from these kind of sages. So I don't know. There are things I'm thinking about. Classic world had these figures. You'd walk around with them, and they would be the kind of teacher to get you through the next phase.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that, of course, drives a lot of this is just the need to constantly produce stuff.
Yeah.
Almost mechanistically, where you're like, okay, I've got a following and I got to get something out there to make them happy. And you just don't have enough time to really mull over and chew on and process, or whatever term you want to use, to get to the place where you've got something really valuable.
And,
to share.
and then what happens is you see, like, for example, you take something like this Charlie Kirk thing, which, could have been a testament to a guy who kind of went on university campuses and did things, but it's now become so sensationalized that everyone's trying to outdo each other on the sensational, the kind of personalities that are out there trying to keep their show going because their substance isn't there. So they need something. And it's just created something so counter to what I think could have been a learning moment. It's a challenge. That's driven too by a certain way in which technology has become a vehicle for selling a product and the need to have content for it that you don't have time to really cultivate.
And I would actually say academia does the same thing.
Yep.
Because nobody ever gets a degree for saying, yeah, Augustine was right. They've got to come up with something original. And the problem is that the problem is that so much of this stuff has been gone over so many times that it's really hard to find a new angle on it. And so you've got to come up with something really outlandish in order to actually, somebody said about Shakespeare, and this is true of Luther as well, anything that is written about Shakespeare is either unoriginal or wrong. And that's true of Luther as well. I mean, all this stuff has been thoroughly gone over. And, there's a lot to be said for retrieval. But if you're doing retrieval, you don't get your PhD.
Yeah. Right. And retrieval's a tricky thing because you're right about doing it. It's like ressourcement as well, but it isn't about repristinating. And there is something that we're talking about today that often isn't talked about in the retrieval conversations. And this is yes, they're getting a hold of a substance that is something that can contribute, but form and substance go together. And if your form has been so impacted in a way that it's driving the direction somewhere else, you have to be looking at the form while you're looking at the retrieval. It's not simply enough to, for example, a lot of people if you just return to scripture alone, without conversing with the theological and moral and formative history of the church, then you're just going to get the pure word. When all you've done is injected, the formation that you've gotten from your secular upbringing and everything else.
That's right. Yeah, it's the old fishbowl and the fish kind of thing. They don't realize what they're swimming in, and they think that they're being just clear-eyed and objective and
seeing
just
it
having a fresh read.
Untainted,
Right. When in fact they're reading it completely through the lens of the sort of modern scene. Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. So there's just a lot to chew on, but I think for me, I've been doing a lot of work on this notion of, one of the things that you're dealing with moral law and natural law is the relationship of something that is inherent in the created order and the moral fabric, but does have kind of on one level, a problem that we're blind to certain things because we're fallen and our desires don't want to see them. So that has one set of things that we have to deal with. There's the Augustinian. And then there is this, and kind of Thomas together. But then there is this other dimension of formation that comes from forms that are unique to our situation now, that also work against being able to see those things. And so in the natural law field, sometimes you have figures that want to just do this kind of, I can just use Enlightenment reason along with the rest of culture, see through reason a kind of moral law that's obviously there that some people just don't want to see because they're not rational enough, and then basically get a hold of it that way. And I'm part of that strand that says, no, that's not going to get you there.
Well, thinking about just aesthetics, the classical thinkers believe that we need our appetites to be developed, that we won't necessarily find really beautiful things appealing or really superior forms of art praiseworthy. That because there's just an assumption that is at work today that if it doesn't appeal to me just sort of immediately and viscerally, that there's nothing there. The idea that's been lost is maybe your ability to to taste needs to be developed. Your ability to see needs to be developed.
And that I think one of the ways in, again, from traditions that our faith grow out of is that beauty is really kind of right there, the connecting of truth and goodness. It is that which the perception, again, it's another kind of language of senses, but our senses are very related to that. And this is what I mean by attentiveness. I mean, think about the lost art of listening to music, right? We listen to get the feeling or but the actual art of listening and the connectedness to the aesthetic and its connectedness to the symphony of creation and redemption, for that matter, it's something lost on us. We don't know how to do it.
Yeah.
Now, I'm willing to admit that I am a Philistine in many respects, but there are a few things that I care about and have gotten enough sort of taste development behind me that I think I have a pretty fair assessment of what's good and bad. So I think that, and I think that maybe that could be something that we can use to appeal to people who, for maybe this is a new idea. Let me give you an example. So I've had guys in my churches over the years who are really into barbecue. I mean, I'm talking about the real thing. I'm not talking about grilling outside. I'm talking about, and they have refined their taste to the point where, I mean, it's just kind of like they're just gourmands, but it's just related to this particular thing. You know, it's what it's like. You know, how to make brisket or whatever, but they have zero tolerance now for McDonald's or anything like that. They've become snooty. Yeah. So these are like snooty blue collar guys who look down on everybody else who can't produce really good brisket. Now, if they could just take that sort of ability to sort of understand, okay, to get really good at anything, you got to apply yourself, you kind of learn the right techniques, you got to experiment and do these different kinds of things, and you end up with something really marvelous, but it took a lot of work. The same thing's true with writing a story. Same thing's true with making a song. You know, you get better at it. Yeah, by working hard and developing your taste and your ability to see quality.
Yeah, and
I read a book in the early 1980s, probably about 1981, by a curator at the Cloisters, which is part of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, dedicated to medieval art. And this guy had tracked down the provenance of a particularly interesting piece, the Bury St. Edmund's Cross. The book was called King of the Confessors. I don't remember the author. But one of the things he said, that as a curator in this museum, he was constantly looking at pictures at this point, you know, they're prints, looking at pictures of great works of art. And he was constantly going over them and over them and over them, nonstop, basically. You know, when he wasn't working, this was what he was doing, because he knew that's what it would take to be a true connoisseur of art, which would be essential if he wanted to really excel in his field. So he was constantly studying great art so that when he came across a piece that was great, he would know what he was looking at.
Yeah.
You talk about educating your taste. I mean, this is a guy who's in a very important position at a very important museum, but he still felt the need to do that.
And there is this process of immersion in and attentiveness that I think just are kind of first steps into the things I'm talking about. Also, thinking about the significance of wisdom and these kind of things, but there's such a rich formative way that Christians in particular, but also kind of the classical world, thought about learning and contemplating and being related to things that are worth thinking about and not rushing by. I think there is wisdom there, especially in the Christian formative traditions, about perceiving and perception and in the relationship of beauty, truth, and goodness in that, and the way in which our appetites are fashioned and formed so that we can begin to see purified love, so that we can begin to relate to these things the right way. And that's hard for us to talk about, especially in kind of the Reformed world, the kind of purified loves and the relationship to reality as gift. It seems it seems like language that is just like, okay, that sounds like what I'm getting at Christmas time, from the person I love. But in a sense, it is. It is theologically speaking.
Yeah, we should probably wrap it up here.
Yeah,
we got to that point where we do wrap things up.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks a lot for listening to this episode of Theology Pugcast, and we appreciate all those folks, especially who help us out with our Patreon account and contribute to the show on a monthly basis. If you'd like to join that intrepid band, those loyal and happy helpers, we would really appreciate it. And there's a link in the show notes to that, to our Patreon page, so that if you'd like to do that, you can. Anyway, that's enough for now. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Westminster Presbyterian Church in Battleground, Washington. The Theology Pugcast is produced and edited by Wiley Craft Productions of Nashville, Tennessee.